right. Thank you, Spock and McCoy. Indeed. Don't they have some of those ears on display at the Smithsonian or something like that? They're probably decomposing. I didn't find any of those lying around when I was walking around the Paramount studios. Let's bring in our guest. He is, of course, Jacob Hornberger. Jacob, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us, my friend. How are you, and welcome to Monday?
Well, I'm doing fine, and it's always an honor and a pleasure and a lot of fun to be with you, Guard.
Absolutely. And happy pre-Bastille Day. Unfortunately, things didn't go all so well, did they?
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I was fascinated to hear about, how Thomas Paine was almost beheaded in the Bastille. That was an amazing thing to consider, and I think they just knocked on the wrong door or something like that. Just absolutely crazy. Well, Jacob, we've been talking a lot about the death of Lindsey Graham and his bloodthirstiness, his attempts to perpetuate himself in the machinery of war, and now Donald Trump, picking his sister to fill his seat. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, just generally. And then if you can find a way, I'd love to sort of translate that into the Cold War mindset and the military arms intelligence industry that seemed to fire Lindsey Graham so much, and how that translates over to a lot of your research about JFK.
Okay, well, I take a little bit different slant on Lindsey Graham and other people of his warmongering ilk. Is that I really don't think the problem that we face in this country is with respect to any individuals, including Trump. They are not the problem. I mean, we often hear, if only we could get better people into public office, everything would be fine. Well, I submit everything would not be fine, because the problem is with the dysfunctional systems that Americans have attached onto the federal government. Those systems are deadly. They're destructive. They have destroyed our liberty, our financial well-being, our money, and so forth. And as long as those systems remain intact, it doesn't matter who's in charge of them. You could put the greatest libertarian in charge of them. It's not going to make any difference, because when you've got an evil system combined with good people, the evil system's always going to win out. And so I try to stay focused on the systems rather than the individuals. And that's where I'm trying to raise people's vision to this higher level, which then segues into this system that we call a national security state. Now, what is a national security state? Well, it's a form of governmental structure with a huge standing military establishment, intelligence establishment, with omnipotent powers, totalitarian-like powers like assassination, including of Americans, torture, indefinite detention, coups. They're not bound by the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. Now, as you know, America was not always a national security state. We started out as a limited government republic, minimal military force, very weak government. There was no income tax. There was no welfare state. The federal government had virtually nothing to do. And that produces a very strong nation. So the nation is not equal to the government. We're talking about two completely separate entities. And this is confirmed by the Bill of Rights, which expressly protects the nation, the people, from the federal government. Well, then World War II comes along, and when there's a buildup gradually over around 1910, we get into the Spanish-American War in 1898, the move toward empire, we get into World War I, World War II. Then comes the national security state. And it was what I contend is a great big racket, that the communists were coming to get us, the Soviet Union. There was a vast communist conspiracy in the world to take over the world.
Yeah.
And it was centered in Moscow, which ironically had been America's partner and ally during World War II.
Right.
That was a transformative event. That's when America became a national security state.
Jacob, this being the first part of a series of conversations with you and sort of cracking open things for the audience and for myself, you've been writing about the JFK assassination and people attached to it, researchers, things like the Zapruder film, and a lot of different things that are so important for people to understand. And one of the things that I thought would be a good way to sort of open things up, to let people know that this is the first part of an introduction here to the subject itself, is this idea of, in economics, what we often is what's often referred to as rent seeking, what is referred to as people might look at it as special interests getting involved in public choice economics, where certain individuals know that if they can get the government to do something for them, the vast majority of people out there, if we put all of what they're losing into the aggregate, it's massive. But for each individual, it's not really in his best interest to go and try to lobby against what is giving a direct benefit to that group or people who are lobbying. And one of the things that I think is important for me to understand is how the mindset of the Cold War led to this burgeoning of the military-industrial complex, and in particular, Cuba. And the impressions that I think a lot of patriotic Americans had was that Castro was evil, had to be gotten rid of, and they didn't really look at the United States machinations and manipulations inside Cuba before then. And that has a lot to do with the Kennedy assassination and the military-industrial complex and the relationship with Russia. Am I incorrect there? Because I know there's sort of a triumvirate of things coming together there.
No, you're absolutely correct. The thing about Cuba, though, it doesn't really enter the picture as far as the Cold War is concerned till around 1959, when Fidel Castro's communist forces, or what became communist forces, ousted the U.S. dictator there, Fulgencio Batista. And the national security state system gets established in 1947 with the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA with its power of assassination, the National Security Agency, I think, gets established in 52. And very quickly, this section of the government becomes the most powerful part of the government. I mean, it's all powerful. And when any one part of government has totalitarian powers, omnipotent powers, that means the whole government has omnipotent powers. I mean, you can say, well, the president's powers are limited and the Congress's powers are limited and the Supreme Court's powers are limited. It's all irrelevant. As long as there's one branch of government that has omnipotent powers, that government has omnipotent powers. And so to justify this, I mean, your point about public choice is right. I mean, there was the so-called defense industry that saw a real benefit from building up this giant national security state. They saw the opportunity to make a lot of money over the coming decades, but they needed a racket. And that racket became fear of communism, that the communists were coming to get us. The Russians were coming, or the Russians are coming. The Russians were coming. There was even a movie made of that title.
Yeah, I remember.
And you're right. The individual American doesn't really have the incentive to oppose us, but the individual American didn't want to oppose it anyway. He bought into all this. This was a time when people believed in the federal government. They trusted the federal government. So if federal officials are saying, we're facing a bigger threat than Nazism, we can't rest now. We've won this World War II, but we can't rest. The communists are coming. They're everywhere. They were in Guatemala, for example, in 1953. 54. This preceded Cuba by some 5 years. So they had a regime change operation. The CIA ousted the democratically elected president of Guatemala because he was a socialist communist. To a certain extent, the same rationale in Iran, ousting Mossadegh from power.
Right.
And so most Americans bought into this, including John Kennedy, that we are facing this foe. That was what the McCarthy hearings were all about. There were communists in the army. There were communists in Hollywood, communists everywhere. And so it was a great big racket. That's what I contended was just a great big racket to justify ever expanding budgets and largesse for this so-called defense establishment.
Do you think it's appropriate, Jacob, to a certain degree, take a little bit of the flavor of some of the left wingers, especially a lot of the British left wingers who were way ahead of me about corporatism and colonialism and things like that? If we look at a person like Max Blumenthal or his wife Anya Parampil, they've done a lot of writing about Venezuela, and a lot of people like Confessions of an Economic Hitman and things like that. And they have successfully, and I think to laudably so, gotten people to sort of grasp that there has been a sort of colonialism in a corporatist fascist way for corporations and politicians and nation states to go invade places, whether it be India or other places, and their friends get the special payoffs. So we look at the Batista regime in Cuba, or we look at Guatemala, or we look at even the support for Chavez in certain ways in Venezuela. And people say he was standing up against, whether or not it's 100% valid, there is a sense that there has been this long-standing support for Marxism or anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism from the end of World War II on, that people in the left-wing side see as sort of the inevitable conclusion of capitalism, which I don't necessarily agree. I think it's the inevitable conclusion of mercantilism and fascism. It's all part of collectivism, whether it's Soviet-style collectivism and those state-run organizations, or it's fascist Donald Trump investing 10% in Intel or whatever it is, or the military-industrial complex. There does seem to be some credence, I think, to how they look at things, and people even in Africa look at the imperialist actions of the Belgians and the British and the French. And they say they were connected with these corporations that drove a lot of the politics. Do you think there's a limit to that sort of assessment when it comes to things like Cuba and the Cold War? Do you think people might have misunderstood some of the intentions of the folks who, say, in Iran sided with some of the communists, or in Venezuela sided with the nationalization of the oil industries, thinking we're opposing some sort of imperialism, to sort of draw out the question? But hopefully I'm expressing that in a way that can draw out something from your research and see what your thoughts are on that over the course of many decades.
Well, your point is a very interesting one, and it relates directly to President Kennedy. Because, like I said earlier, everybody comes into America after World War II as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior, that we've got to fight the Cold War. We don't have a choice. We have to have this giant, what Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex. And he says that in his farewell address. He says, this is a newfangled way of life we have here. He points that out. And he says, and it's a grave threat to our democratic processes and our freedoms here in this country. We need to watch this very carefully, but it's essentially a necessary evil to stop this communist threat. So Kennedy comes into power with that same mindset, except with one exception, and that's on these colonialist wars for independence in Africa and elsewhere, that there were nations that were declaring independence from their colonial masters, England, France, Belgium, and so forth. Kennedy was siding with those independence movements. And the Pentagon and the CIA were saying these independence movements were communist driven. So they were opposing them. They were siding on the side of the imperial powers, saying they should be able to maintain these colonies, because if they don't, the communists are going to get closer and closer. The dominoes are going to start falling. So immediately, when Kennedy comes into power as president, he is under suspicion. Because remember, the CIA under Eisenhower's a fairly old guy. He's sort of a passive type presidency. The the CIA could do anything it wanted. I mean, those 8 years, they had carte blanche. So their power was immense. So here's this neophyte president coming in that doesn't, supposedly know what he's doing, that is siding with these colonial powers naively, assisting unwittingly the communists in their eyes. And so Kennedy comes under suspicion right away that, this guy could be a problem. So immediately they present him with this plan to invade Cuba. Now that raises what you brought up, that Cuba plays a central role in this by the time Kennedy comes into office, which was in 1961. And they immediately present him with this plan and say, well, we had this plan working under Eisenhower. He approved it, but we haven't had time. We're going to invade the island. And using Cuban exiles, the U.S. is not going to show any role in this at all. We're going to act like we're totally innocent. So they were training these guys somewhere, Nicaragua, Honduras, one of those things, about 1,000 Cuban exiles. And Kennedy says, well, I don't want any U.S. intervention here. And they say, oh, Mr. President, there won't be any intervention. We don't need air support. We don't need an invasion. None of that, because our intelligence says the Cuban people will rise up and oppose Castro. Well, as it turned out, it was a lie. They knew that the Cuban people would never do that. They knew these 1,000 guys could never stand up to Fidel Castro's army in this invasion that turned out at the Bay of Pigs. But they figured they could manipulate this neophyte president, because as soon as these exiles start to get massacred or captured there on the beach, he's going to have no choice. He can't let them fall to the communists. And so he's going to have to send in the air support. He's going to have to send in invading troops. So they were manipulating him. And so sure enough, that's what happens. They're getting massacred there on the beach, these 1,000 guys. So the CIA comes to Kennedy and says, well, Mr. President, we were wrong. We need the air support after all. And thinking that he's going to have to provide this air support. He can't let America get defeated by the communists. And so Kennedy says, no, I told you there would be no support. We both agreed on that. You told me it wasn't necessary. Oh, yes, but now things have changed. No support at all. And so those guys get killed, massacred, captured there at the Bay of Pigs, and Kennedy lets them. And so they go down in defeat at the hands of the communists. Well, this was the start of the war between Kennedy and the CIA. And Kennedy knew he had been lied to. He figured that out. He vowed to destroy the CIA. His words were something like, I'm going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds.
Yeah.
The CIA hated him. They called him a coward, a traitor, a betrayer. A lot of the Cuban Americans felt the same way. That was the start of the war.
It's interesting, Jacob, because coming from my experience growing up in the shadow of the assassination, that Bay of Pigs, and you probably are very well aware of it with your writing, you've referred to this many times, the rancor that the right-wing anti-Soviet establishment directed, the venom that they directed towards Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs, and the way that they portrayed the Bay of Pigs as being the potential to have saved all those people in Cuba from this terrible fate that awaited them under Castro. It just removes so much information about what Kennedy was thinking, how he had been lied to, and what the United States continued to do to Cuba and the Cuban people afterwards, which was to establish its own Iron Curtain in the middle of the ocean between Florida and Cuba, and to block trade and basically try to starve the government out and impose on us the sorts of collectivist trappings of you can't do this or we will hurt you that I thought were so terrible under people like Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev and others. It's amazing. So in this introduction to this, as a way to tell people, what might be coming, Jacob, if we look at this temporally, time-wise, and you're a young guy and you see this happen, a kid, and you see this happen, can you tell us what you knew at the time, and then what triggered your attempt to research this further as a way to introduce us to the topic?
Yeah, that's my story on the Kennedy assassination is totally different from most everybody else's. I was in the 5th grade when Kennedy and Johnson were running, and my dad was active in politics. He was a lawyer there in my hometown of Laredo, so I would go down to campaign headquarters every night, and I stuffed envelopes for John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, wow.
And I worked hard for him. And then my dad went on a trip with a bunch of other men from Laredo to the Johnson Ranch for a campaign rally in the hill country. And he took me with him. And so my dad introduces me to Lyndon, and Lyndon says, "Son, what are you doing for me down there in Laredo?" And I said, "I'm stuffing envelopes for you, Mr. Johnson." And so, this was near and dear to my heart when I was a kid. So Kennedy gets assassinated. I'm standing outside biology class in junior high school, and this girl, Becky, comes up and says, "Kennedy's been assassinated." And I'm like everybody else. So you remember where you were and how it happened. Well, Guard, I go the rest of my life for the next several decades never knowing that anybody was suspecting anything than the official narrative, that he had been assassinated by a former communist Marine who happened to get off 3 shots from this building, and 2 of them end up hitting the Kennedy, and there's this magic bullet, but I didn't even know about the magic bullet. I had no reason to question the narrative. I didn't know that there were people questioning the narrative all the way till I was about 40 years old. So suddenly Oliver Stone comes out with this movie, JFK. I didn't know it was a controversial movie. I was just starting the Future of Freedom Foundation. That was all my focus, all my efforts. I wasn't keeping track of movie reviews or the controversy. So when I see this movie, JFK, I'm thinking it's just a biography of the president that I had worked for in the 5th grade. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting movie. I think I'll go watch it. Well, I'm blown away. I mean,
wow.
I'm absolutely blown away. Because its thesis is that this was a regime change operation, highly sophisticated, that framed an innocent man as part of its process and then shut down the investigation. Well, I walked out of there just totally shocked, out of the movie theater, just shocked. How could I not have heard about this? And so at the end of the movie, there's a little blurb that the national security state is still keeping their records relating to the assassination secret. And so that blows up. The American people go nuts over that. And they pressure Congress into enacting the JFK Records Act that I think was enacted in 92. Oliver Stone's movie was around 1990, 91.
Yeah.
The JFK Records Act, 92. And then the Assassination Records Review Board in 92, 93, whose job it is to enforce the disclosure of these records, because the Pentagon and the CIA did not want to disclose their assassination-related record, even though it was 30 years later. So at that point, when I see this movie, I decide that I want to research it. So I start going out and buying every book I can find. Mark Lane's book on it, which I think was the first book. He was a lawyer from New York that was questioning the official version from the very beginning. And I got every book I could get my hand on. And, I'd been a lawyer. I was trained as a lawyer. I practiced law for 12 years. I did criminal cases. And over time, I concluded, they convinced me this was a regime change operation, but I couldn't prove it. I mean, I believed it to be true, but if I had to walk into a courtroom to prove it, I couldn't do it. I mean, even despite the suspicious things like the magic bullet theory and how the whole thing worked out. And Oswald was claiming he was innocent. They kept saying, he did it to show he was a big man. Well, a big man would be bragging about having done it. So there was inconsistencies. There was Secret Service personnel up on the grassy knoll, and the Secret Service said, well, we didn't have anybody up there. So there was a lot of suspicious stuff, but not enough to convict. Mm-hmm. And so I went this for several years, maybe more than 10 years, thinking, well, okay, I have no doubts they did it, but I can't prove it. Not beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the word in a criminal case. Until I came across a 5-volume book, huge, big book, by a guy named Douglas Horn, who had served on the Assassination Records Review Board. And I start reading this book from cover to cover, all 5 volumes. It's very complex in sections. But at the end of that, there was no question in my mind. There was no doubt. I could walk into any court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt because of what Horn documented, not on the assassination, because I still don't think you could prove that they did it just from what happened on the day of the assassination there in Dallas. I don't think anybody can prove that the national security state did this. This Horn's book revolved around the autopsy that was conducted on Kennedy's body. And when I read that the autopsy, which was conducted by the military, was a fraudulent autopsy, it was case closed for me as a lawyer, because there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy.
Right.
And that's when I knew that they could do it, and it had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
You know, Jacob, it's very interesting to hear your organic process in starting to investigate this. And what I think would be constructive is, you know, you've written about a lot of facets of this that are so important, including the Zapruder film itself. And so I want to go to the Rumble chat, get some thoughts on this, and then ask you if you can name for us, I'll give you a couple seconds to think about this, sort of floating in your mind for a second, but if you can name for us a couple of the major, if you can call them categories or individuals or groups that people might want to keep in mind for next time when we talk, that I think would be a really good setup for people to sort of whet their appetite and find out more. And then I'd like to talk to you about where they can find your work and the work of others. We've been showing some of this on the screen over at Amazon on your research on this, because again, there are so many facets of this, but it all helps crystallize, in my eyes, the way that the people behind the military-industrial complex and the CIA and certain facets of the FBI utilized their strength from the 50s into the 60s into getting involved in the Reagan administration, and then where that led us after 9/11. Because I think a lot of those people are the same people, or they are the scions within the opportunist circles that existed from World War II on, those types of people. So let me do this, Jacob. I want to turn to the Rumble chat and see if anybody has any questions over at Rumble. Let me know, and if I've missed anything, just repost your comment or anything like that. And some people, I think, are also concerned, Jacob, about the Mossad Israeli influence. They look at the big moves of things like Epstein and blackmail and things like that. Would you say that there's crossover in some of that? I've noticed some of the people mentioning Epstein inside the Rumble chat.
Absolutely. But with respect to the Kennedy assassination, there's been books written alleging that Israel was involved in this. Kennedy was trying to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons, and they were furious about that, so they had motive. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that there is no direct evidence at all that Israel was involved in the assassination. That's not to say they didn't help out and so forth, but the real critical thing to keep in mind, critical things to keep in mind as we go forward with this. One is the war that took place, that continued taking place after the Bay of Pigs between Kennedy and the national security establishment. That's worth exploring, because we got Operation Northwoods in there, which was a false flag operation that was being presented to Kennedy by the national security establishment. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they compared him to Neville Chamberlain for the deal that he made with the communists. And then the famous peace speech at American University, where it was clear that Kennedy achieved a breakthrough that enabled him to see that this Cold War was just a great big deadly and very dangerous racket. So motive is one area that really is critically important here, is this war that was taking place between Kennedy and the national security establishment, a war that Kennedy ended up losing. Then the second thing is the autopsy. Now, the autopsy takes place after the assassination, but it is the critical link in terms of circumstantial evidence, and we can discuss the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. But there is no question that there was one entity that engaged in that, conducted that autopsy. That's the U.S. military. The Mossad was not there. The Mafia was not there, as far as we know. Space aliens weren't there. Fidel Castro wasn't there. The military was there. They conducted the autopsy. So once it becomes clear that this is a fraudulent autopsy, they're hiding the results here, the actual results. That's how we know that they engaged in the assassination, because there's no innocent explanation for this. Once you catch them doing a fraudulent autopsy on the very night of the assassination, then you know that they had to have orchestrated and carry out the assassination, because that's not something you do on the spur of the moment. Say, hey, we're going to have a fraudulent autopsy here. But the facts surrounding that fraudulent autopsy, they don't come clear till at least 10 years later, and mostly about 20 years late, 30 years later, with Assassination Records Review Board that this guy Doug Horn served on. And then the third thing is the Zapruder film that you mentioned. So once you realize that they were doing shenanigans with the only real film of the assassination, you put all of this together and you realize there's only one conclusion that can be drawn here. And that's why people that say this is an unresolved case, this is a cold case, that's pure nonsense. It has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt through circumstantial evidence, indirect evidence, autopsy, Zapruder film, that this was a national security state regime change operation.
Wow. And by the way, kudos to Front Porch Media Inside Rumble, who was talking about Operation Northwoods almost a couple seconds before you brought it up. And let me ask you this, Jacob, before we go. Did your opinion and position on Lee Harvey Oswald drastically change as you started to do your research, and where did that take you? I'm curious.
Absolutely it did, because as I'm putting this together, it's like a mosaic. You're putting all these little pieces of the puzzle, because there's never going to be a smoking gun. There's not going to be a videotaped confession. It's really circumstantial evidence. And every court in the land, every judge will tell a jury, circumstantial evidence is just as valid as direct evidence. And so as I'm putting all these pieces together, I'm saying, how does it fit in this thing where Oswald is working for the national security establishment? Why would they put really an amateur up there? I mean, this guy's not a professional assassin. He wasn't that good a shot in the Marine Corps. Why would they do that? And why in a shot that's coming as the motorcade's moving away, that's a very difficult shot. Why not when he's directly coming up Houston Street? But why not professional assassins? None of this was making sense to me. And then I remember having a conversation with a guy named David Lifton, who wrote a transformative book in this area called Best Evidence. It reads like a adventure novel. I mean, it's just a mystery novel. You can't put it down once you start it. Yeah. And Lifton called me one day to discuss something, and it was like, wow, David Lifton, because he's a giant in this area. And I told him, I said, I'm having trouble with fitting in Oswald into this whole mosaic here. And he says, that's because you're not looking at it another way. And I said, how's that? He says that he was innocent, that he was exactly who he said he was. He was a patsy. He was being framed. And wow, everything falls into place
Yeah.
at that point. It's
Yeah.
like,
Right.
wow. So I go back as a lawyer. I'm putting all the pieces together. That makes sense now.
Yeah.
As I'm
Right.
putting the pieces of the puzzle together, the fact that he was set up to take the fall fits perfectly as one of the pieces of the puzzle.
You know, it's interesting, Jacob. I've been looking at Earl Stanley Gardner's novels of Perry Mason, and looking into the Perry Mason television show and how they tried, with great exactitude, they tried to make sure that the legal proceedings were correct. They always had attorneys on hand, and they literally, the actors and scriptwriters became so conversant on legal jargon that they actually did a mock trial while they were out on vacation somewhere in an island for some local people. And I'm thinking about how the awareness of law and the requirements for evidence and the research that's necessary really lent itself to, you know, your interest, your area of interest already lent itself to digging into this stuff. And so you were sort of like a Perry Mason here, you know, looking at what happened to Oswald. And I'd love to talk to you about that. And the next time we get to chat, if we can, next time we talk about this for part 2 after this introduction, I'd like to ask you, Jacob, about a little bit about the Lyndon Johnson influence, the Lyndon Johnson connection. And if you want to, you frame it the way you want to, that gives people the best way to understand this Intel military industrial complex background and the actual forces that were behind the assassination of JFK in a second part. If we can return to you in a week or 2 weeks or something like that to hear from you again, to say, okay, guard, everybody, here are some of the major players as we go into this. You think that would be a good approach?
It'd be a fantastic approach. In fact, if people want to do a little bit of homework that are first getting exposed to this concept, because, you know, we often hear conspiracy theory, and then all these theories, and so it all gets muddled down. But if somebody would like to do some homework on this, the very best book to read in this whole area is called JFK and the Unspeakable: Why He Died and Why It Matters by James W. Douglas. It is the finest, detailed, scholarly presentation of what happened here in terms of motive. Doesn't go into the autopsy, but in terms of the overall scope of this war that was going on between Kennedy, it is an absolutely fantastic way to get the big picture and a lot of the details of the big picture just reading this book. And so if somebody would like to do a little homework before our next segment, that would be the best place to go to.
That sounds great. JFK and the Unspeakable.
JFK right. And the Unspeakable. Okay. Why he see this is to me the most fascinating part of this assassination now. It's not the bullet trajectories and so forth. It's why he died and why it matters. And you see, now this brings up what you were talking about earlier about, you know, the war on terrorism, the national security state today, Ukraine, Russia, Iran, it all fits together once you start putting things in a great, big, long period. Because the important thing to understand here is that if Kennedy had won the war, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have all this stuff that we're living under. That was the conflict of visions between John Kennedy, who had broken through and realized that this whole thing was a racket, and said, I'm going to move America in a completely different direction. And the national security state says, oh, no, you're not. You have become a threat to national security. You're naive. You're incompetent. And now the war is on. And they end up winning the war, and that the Cold War goes on. When the Cold War unexpectedly ends, you get the war on terrorism after that, the Persian Gulf intervention, and they're off to the races again. And now they got the best of all worlds. They got the war on Russia and the war on terrorism.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, the thing that troubles me also, as a sort of a side note, Jacob, is if we take this and one starts to reassess his position on this, it then calls into question so much of the other information that for so long I have held as being very solid information and is true, the works of Robert Conquest and others about Soviet Russia, about Mao, the Great Leap Forward, Peking Spring, and all these different types of things that are pieces of solid information. The gulags, The Long Walk is an amazing book about those men who walked all the way from Siberia to India and to escape the gulags, and these stories now, given especially the way that they try to give us these narratives about, say, Vladimir Putin, my life was directly affected by this. I was trying to explain to people that there was no connection between Putin and Trump. And I was trying to explain that it wasn't the Russians that so-called hacked the DNC in 2016, that the data had to have been removed by a flash drive. It couldn't have gone through phone lines because it went too quickly. I was writing about, as I mentioned, the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act in 2016, and that ended up funding NewsGuard, which then ended up attacking me at MRC TV for trying to reveal the truth about Ukraine. I mean, it was insane. It was just crazy. And, I think about the higher profile people like Oliver Stone or you, who's been doing this work, and I say, how much, and Oliver Stone, much more left-wing guy, I say, how much of this information that I've been given by the Cold War establishment about Soviet Russia, about Stalin, about Khrushchev, about Leonid Brezhnev, and these types of things, how much of it can I believe? Or how much of it was done for the purpose of ginning up hatred to perpetuate this long-term Cold War, polar battle between the West and the East?
Well, I would default to the communists really did some horrendous things. I mean, nobody was going to downplay the mass murderers and the brutality of these communist regimes. But it's like John Quincy Adams said in his 4th of July address in 1821, there's a lot of monsters around the world, but America should not be going abroad to slay those monsters. Yeah. And what they did was they seized on the horrors of communism that we should never downplay to change America's governmental system to really one of a communist totalitarian regime. And that was their argument. In order to, that the communists are not constrained by a Bill of Rights, and they're going to beat us. They're going to win. They're going to take over America. And so in order to prevent that from happening, we need to become like them by adopting their type of governmental system, not entirely, but with respect to a national security state with powers of assassination, powers of torture, indefinite detention. And that as soon as we win the Cold War, the argument was, you can have your limited government republic back. This is just going to be temporary. And then to their shock, in 1989 or 90 or so, the Cold War suddenly over. The Soviet Union says, enough, we're done. Well, they were shocked. And for a while, here's the irony, the Pentagon and the CIA were saying, well, no, there shouldn't be a peace dividend here. We can fight the drug war.
Oh, of course.
But they'll always, a national security state always needs official enemies. They need crises. They need conflict in order to keep people afraid, insecure, because that's what keeps the money flowing. I mean, look, they're now asking for $1.5 trillion.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Yeah. And that's how the racket works.
Unbelievable. And, the final thing I'll say, Jacob, is that I'm seeing what I tried to warn students about this in economics class, this mythology that war pulls an economy out of a depression or recession. And I remember in high school, I would have arguments with my teachers about this. And I said, look, you're not improving GDP by shoveling resources into destruction and death. It doesn't work that way. You're not making more hospital beds. You're not making new medicines. You're not growing food cheaply. You're not doing anything about building houses more cheaply. You're steering those resources into things that are going to get blown up and blow people up. And So now what do we see with the EU? What do we see with NATO? That's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to shift their economies, especially in Germany. And Donald Trump telling auto manufacturers today, well, you could build bombs. It never stops. So that's all I'll say for tonight, Jacob. And I just sincerely appreciate your work. And by the way, up on the screen, I put up the Encounter with Evil, which I got a couple years ago. That is an absolutely fascinating, not just an addendum, but it serves to, again, bolster the argument that some very nefarious characters were involved with manipulating that to hide what they really did. And it's a great, great book. It's wonderful. You did a great job on that.
Thank you, Gard. And thank you for having me on again. It's always an honor and a pleasure to share ideas. You charge up my batteries every time I'm here. So, we're a small bunch, but we're out there at the front lines. That's for sure.
Yeah, you got it, man. And sometime when I get out on the road, I'll come visit you, and we'll get some ice cream and a shake or something like that. And we'll sit down and talk favorite books and stuff. And by the way, Jacob, some night, I've mentioned this to other guests, some night I do fiction on Wednesdays and Fridays. I talk fiction. If you ever want to, give me a list of some of the scariest short stories or your favorite authors or whatever, fantasy, novels, adventure, anything like that. Because I'd like to create a list of some of our guests and things that they would recommend to people. Okay?
Okay, but let me say something earlier about what you said about coming to see me. All I ask is that you lose whatever tails you have, because I don't want the government to find out about me. I know they're following you.
Yeah, I'll teleport. I'll get Scotty to beam me in.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Jacob. You're a great. It's a great honor every time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Oh, and by the way, and thank you for your work for trying to help Ian too. I wanted to mention that again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good
Until
stuff.
next time.
You got
Keep
it.
Up.
Thanks so much, Jacob. All right, Jacob Hornberger, everybody, a good man. Follow him at Future Freedom Foundation. He knows where it's at, as Leonard Nimoy would say in the song "Where It's At" on the album "The Touch of Leonard Nimoy." Now it's time for our Liberty Conspiracy Mind Meld to go back to Vulcan and then come back to the show.